Thank you. You should have a handout, and I just noticed that I need a handout as well. So, thank you, Agnes. Yes, I'm very grateful, first of all, to be here this evening, to be able to present part of my research to you, and to be able to also get you, if you have your feedback and your reactions. And I'm also very happy and thankful to be at the École for this whole year. It's an extraordinary opportunity to work here in this environment. I want to start with I think you all know the scene we are looking at. It's a picture by Rembrandt that depicts the scene where Jesus meets Thomas after the resurrection. I think you all know the scene, and I want to start looking at the sentence that you supposedly all know as well. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. In this sentence, this is like the risen Christ bursts into the room with the disciples. This sentence bursts the context of this room, because the disciples that are in the room are those who see. And after Thomas has made his confession to the Lord, they all believe. So in the room, on the level of the narrative, everyone is believing. But in this sentence, Jesus addresses the reader of the gospel and tells him, blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. And for the attentive reader of the gospel, this poses a problem, because what he learned about believing is that what he read about the disciples. The disciples are those who came to believe, who are in the environment of Jesus, and who believe because they saw, they heard, they touched the incarnated Word of God. So this sentence addresses a problem that the reader of the gospel is very much aware of, that he himself is not in the same position as the disciples, that he has to somehow bridge the gap between past and present, his present and the past that was the present of the disciples, where they could encounter Jesus himself. And this well-known verse from the Gospel of John promises us that there is a way to do that there is a way to bridge this gap. But it does not really explain us how this is going to work. But it promises us that if we trace it, if we go through the Johannine literature, we might find and we might be able to explore how that is going to work. And I want to give you a little insight on how, first of all, I want to show you that the Johannine literature wants to explain us how this bridging between past and present works. And second of all, I want to give you a little bit of an idea how this bridge between past and present, respectively present and past, works. To do that, we will take three steps, three big steps. First of all, I want to speak about the conditions and premises of my research. Of course, in a very short way, we will have a glimpse into the research history, especially the German research history. we will look a little bit at methodology, how are the phenomena of a text and the phenomenon of time, how are they connected, and how can we draw a connection, and how can we explore this connection. And a third short thing, we have to look at the relationship between, the historical relationship between the gospel, and also the literary relationship between the Gospel of John and the first letter of John. The reason why we have to take the first letter of John into account is that I'm convinced that one of the key passages to answer this question of past and present in the Johannine literature is not found in the Gospel itself, but in the first letter of John, namely at the beginning of the first letter of John. So we will, in the main part of this conference, interpret these verses at the beginning of the first letter of John, in order to come back to the Gospel and back to our to the narration of Jesus and Thomas, and to prove that what we find in the beginning of the first letter can also be found at the end of the Gospel, and to give you at least an example that this is an idea that shapes and characterizes the whole Gospel. So let's start with a glimpse into research history, and doing that, I really have to paint with a very broad brush. I have to because there is so much literature on and research on Johannine literature but I want to point out a very influential and a very controversial part of this research. And to do that, I have to start with this man, a German philosopher from the 18th century, who was very influential at least in the German history of exegesis and theology, especially in the Protestant for the Protestant research. Because he uttered this famous saying that there is an ugly broad ditch that divides us from Jesus. Why does he think that there is an ugly broad ditch that divides us? Because he says that every historical knowledge can only be a hypothesis. So even if we listen to the accounts, to the testimonies of those who knew Jesus, we can only have an hypothesis, and an hypothesis can be false. So the image we can get of Jesus can never be the evidence that a contemporary eyewitness of Jesus has. So he says, if we want to believe in something, and that is his philosophy of enlightenment, if we want to believe in something, we should not believe on a historical basis, but we have to believe on the grounds of reason, and reason does not really tell us about history. You see that this is not a comment on Johannine literature in itself, but if we move to the next, again a philosopher, to the next researcher, we move closer to the Johannine literature. Søren Kierkegaard tried to find a theological, a systematic answer to this claim that Lessing made, and he said, he agreed with Lessing that our historical knowledge can only have the character of a hypothesis, but faith means to affirm something with certainty. So he concludes, we never can believe, we never can have faith in something historical, because faith means, by definition, that we affirm something with certainty. But how to believe then at all, how to believe in Jesus? The solution that Kierkegaard finds is that we have to reduce our image of Jesus. I mean, we can have an historical image of Jesus, but it's not relevant. We need to reduce the significant parts of Jesus' life to his incarnation and to the resurrection. Just that. And he argues that these two things, that God becomes man and that he rises from the death, are things that history itself cannot produce. So the notion that God became man is either absolutely foolish and dumb, or it is a notion that did not originate in history, but that came from God into history and is transported through history like kind of something that is actually not a part of it. And he says believing means that we get out of this flow of world history and put the trust that our existence allows us on this notion that God became man, that we put our existence basically out of history and into this this bursting of history. This is again a philosophical and systematic account, but you can see that we get closer to a reading of John, because the important vocabulary that Kierkegaard uses is that of world, the world that is actually not the real reality, and the other thing is that he emphasizes that God became man, like we find it in the beginning of the Gospel of John. So Kierkegaard himself can be read as an interpretation of John. And the last person that I want to look at is really arriving in Johannine scholarship. That is Rudolf Bultmann, but he is building up on the systematic theology that Kierkegaard created. And he says that the Gospel of John, next to Paul, is the testimony for what Kierkegaard developed in the New Testament. So the Gospel of John uses the frame of a biography, of a gospel, of an historical account, of a narration, but that is actually not what is important in the Gospel of John. But this frame is deliberately, let's say, pushed aside to make room, especially in the speeches, to make room again and again for the repeated notion that God became man, that the Father has sent the Son. This is his basic understanding of the Gospel of John. that it's putting history aside to make room for this, what he calls kerygma, for this proclamation of faith, that, and the faith is, as I repeated from Kierkegaard, that God became man regardless of the historical circumstances that had, and belief, another vocabulary, another word that is very important for the Gospel of John, and he describes this Johannine belief as just the existential way of saying yes to this kerygma, to the kerygma that God destroyed the context of the world, and it's possible to believe and trust in God. I wanted to point out this this part of scholarship, this part of research, because it gives us, it presupposes a certain account of what we have asked for, of the relationship between past and present in Johannine literature. And the answer that Bultmann arrives at is the past is a necessary condition, but its images, its circumstances are not at all interesting. What is only interesting is the kerygma of the Word that became flesh. So what we want to do in this, what I want to show you in this conference a little bit, is that this is not necessarily what the close reading of the Johannine literature, in my opinion, would lead to, but that we should, and that is especially important for German scholarship, that we should revise this picture of the relationship of past and present in Johannine scholarship. To do that, I want to tell you first a little bit about the methodology that I'm using to interpret the texts, because one can ask the question: how do you do that? How do you see the relationship? How do you explore the relationship between past and present in a text? Is it just, do we have to look for passages in John where we have an explicit theory about the relationship of past and present? And we won't find a lot of texts in John that have a philosophical account on past and present. But a text itself, if we look into text linguistics, a text itself deals always with the problem of a relationship between past and present. This is the graphic I show you is only one example of how to frame a textual linguistic that understands a text as communication. I don't want to get into a detailed discussion of it. You have to, there are different models, different understandings, but the basic idea of is that a text is a communication itself, and that it is based in a communication. And a communication, a textual communication is something that happens between past and present, because the act of writing happens at one point in time, the act of reading happens at another point in time, and so the text is already a connection of, every text is already a connection of past and present, and we are actually here on the outside of our graphic. And what we what we find, if we look into the text itself, is that this communication is reproduced. That means that in a text we can find an implied author and an implied reader who can they can be put on different levels of time, and then again we find in a narrative text, but I think we can apply this model also to texts that are not narrative in the strict sense. We have the narrator and the narratee, and there we can also establish a relationship, or there's always a relationship established that can be put on different levels of time. So if I look at Johannine Literature, and if I'm asking for past and present, I'm looking at these communicative relationships and on what level of past or present they are put. Then to the last point that we need to ask ourselves: how do we relate the Gospel of John to the first letter of John? Of course, I cannot give a whole account on this here, but I just want to mention, especially for those who are not so deep into this research, the letter of John is not a letter in the stricter sense of the word. A letter, as you might know, is a particular genre in antiquity where we have very strict rules how a letter has to work. And if we read the first letter of John, we find that these rules are actually not applied. So what is the first letter of John? We have to know that we probably have something like a Johannine community. So a community of whoever it was, that is a big research question, kind of someone like theologians or scribes, or and they reflect on the tradition of the Johannine, of this community, again and again and again. And by that they produce texts. They probably produce a gospel in different steps, and then this production of literature does not stop with the gospel, but we find 3 letters, and 2 of them, the second letter of John and the third letter of John, are actually letters, and the first letter is something different, but it seems to be a very basic theological account on what it means to be a believer in Jesus in the present. So there again we find this switch that the gospel is talking about the past, and that we find another piece of writing that talks about the present, and that addresses in the same language that the gospel uses, but does not tell the story of Jesus, but tells us about the existence of a Christian in its respective present. And the connection between the gospel and this first letter of John are the first 4 verses of the first letter of John that I would like to look into now. And the handout, you should find the Greek text and the English translation that I'm going to use, because we could have some people in the audience that are not Greek speaking. Like this. Yeah. So I'll begin by reading out the translation. What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we looked upon and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. And the life was revealed, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaim to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim now to you, so that you may have fellowship with us. For our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing this so that our joy may be complete. The structure of these entering words into the first letter of John, the structure is very particular. It needs a lot of analysis, but basically we have a fragmentary or elliptic relative clause in the beginning, then a parenthesis, verse 2, that takes one word from one very important word from the first verse, zoe, life, takes it into verse 2 and gives us an explanation on this word. And then the first verse is picked up again, the relative clause is picked up again and finished in verse 3. And then we have another explanation here in the second half of verse 3, where the word koinonia, as it's translated here, fellowship, is taken up again and explained. And then in verse 4 we have graphomen, tauta graphomen hemes, the explanation why this letter is written. If we look at, if we read this text, a first impression might be, and it should also be the first impression of the reader, of the historical intended reader, that we have a lot of similarities to the prologue, to the beginning of the Gospel of John. I've highlighted here all these the vocabulary that is similar, and but if we look closely on the text, we see that the structure is very different from the prologue of John, because the text is never talking about Jesus or the word of life as the actual subject of these verses. If we look again at the structure of the relative clauses that begin in verse 1 and lead to verse 3, then we see that the goal of this text is this notion: Evangelomen kai hymin, we proclaim to you. So what we can see here is that these first verses of the first letter of John play with the prologue, but they also want to develop the prologue further into a different situation, and especially this Evangelomen we proclaim to you shows that we are not talking about the revelation and those who receive it, but that we talk about the tradition of the revelation. That we talk about a we that is distinguished from a you, but that is put into a certain relationship. I want to highlight that there is this strong difference between the we, the first person, the pronoun of the first person plural, and the second person plural. This we and you. We can see this if we look at the use of the different pronouns or the verbs that are in the first person plural. They are highlighted green, so that is a feature of the text that is very, very, very present. And then we have highlighted in blue the second person plural, and the important point is that there is a characteristic distinction between those, between the we and the you. And this distinction shows especially here, Evangelomen kai hymin, we also proclaim this to you. So what we found, the we, the first person plural, what they are characterized by, that proclaimed that also to the you. So there's a distinction, and then we have, I forgot to highlight that, hina kai hymeis, so that you also might have fellowship with us, a fellowship that we already have, that you don't have, and that you need to get from us. So this distinction between the first person plural and the second person plural is a very important one in this text and should not be overlooked by interpreting it. We go on by asking, what is the characterization of this we, of this first person plural that we find in the text, and that does not identify itself with a name. And there we can look in the first verse where we find a lot of verbs of perception. And these verbs of perception are attributed to this we. It's this we that is doing that is hearing, that is seeing, and that is touching. And if we look in the Gospel of John, we see that these verbs of perception are not something to be overlooked, but they can be traced through the whole Gospel, and they do not only mean that someone is physically seeing something or that someone is physically touching something, but it means if they refer to Jesus, and in the Gospel of John they mostly refer to Jesus, that it means a way to come to believe. So if someone is beginning to believe, that is marked with these words of hearing, touching not so much, but hearing and seeing are the most important one. How is that understood in this in the Gospel of John? is it like a mystical thing that you see something or that you hear something? No, it means the physical act of seeing Jesus and hearing Jesus, but it means more than that. It means that that by seeing and hearing him, we can identify him as the one who he is, as the Son of God, as the one who has heard the words of the Father, who is repeating the words of the Father. And not only identifying Jesus as the one who he is, but also bringing us ourselves into a relationship to Jesus and redefining us by this relationship. So hearing these verbs of perception mean an act that happens on different levels. An act of the physical act is a part of it, but it's also the act of identifying who Jesus is and redefining yourself. That this is what is meant can also be seen with the word ephanerote, that we could translate with revealed, in verse 2. In the Gospel of John, this means the complementary divine act to this verbs of perception. So these verbs of perception react to the revealing that Jesus does, and this revealing means that in his human acts, the will of the Father and the acts of the Father can be identified. So we have this complementary acts of the disciples that see the incarnated Son of God, and that what the incarnated Word of God actually does. So, if we go back to the question, how is this first person plural characterized? That is very clearly, it's the eyewitnesses. It's the eyewitnesses that actually see and hear, and that are we need a distinction to this humin, who are not the eyewitnesses, but who are supposed to come into koinonia with the eyewitnesses. Now to the relationship that is established between this we and between the you. It's established mainly by this claim of apangelomen, this proclamation that is happening. The proclamation, and what is the object of the proclamation, what is proclaimed, that is what we have here, these experiences of the eyewitnesses. This is proclaimed, and now a very important and interesting thing is that this apangelomen, this proclamation, is given to us in present. So that is something that happens presently, that the experiences of the eyewitnesses are proclaimed to those who who receive this proclamation. But they, from the remaining parts of the letter, we know that actually this proclamation has already happened to those who are intended to read the letter, because we have several references to a proclamation of the gospel that has already happened. So why is this proclamation here in the present? Because I am sure of, because it's an ongoing necessity that the experiences of the eyewitness are, how to say that in English, are reproclaimed, and that they are made, we could say that they are made accessible, so that this koinonia met hemon, this koinonia between the eyewitnesses and those, the later generations that are supposed to read this letter, that they happen. We could go on the characteristics of this koinonia in the that are presented here, but I want to move a step further and go back to this distinction between a textual level, the level of the text, and its reference outside of the text. Because when we look into a history of the Johannine community, at least in the mainstream research, we see that this text is probably not written by the eyewitnesses themselves, but that it is an account of what the gospel speaks about when it tells us the experiences of the eyewitnesses. How can this text claim to be authentic if the we that is speaking is not in an extra textual sense the eyewitnesses that are speaking? The answer we have is that we have an intertextual idea, that the gospel brings to life the voices of the disciples, and by being performed in the Johannine community keeps these voices alive, so that if a text like this refers to the vocabulary of the gospel and makes clear reference to the gospel, it can claim maybe not to be written by the eyewitnesses, but to express their experiences in an authentic way, and to direct these experiences towards those who are reading. I stop with this remarks on the beginning of the first letter of John, and try to summarize them a little bit. we have the notion of a community that is defined by the experiences of the eyewitnesses, and so past experiences, and that is but that the ones who are addressed by the letter should be a part of, so that the present readers of the letter, that intended reader of the letter, should be a part of the koinonia that is marked by the experience of the eyewitnesses. And how is this koinonia established? It is established by what we see here by the proclamation. And proclamation is not only giving information, but it is the vivid and transmission of experiences, not only but also via literature. So we see that this introduction to the first letter of John has a very high esteem of what literature, what concretely the Gospel of John can do in transmitting the experiences of the eyewitnesses. That I have done. Now, if we go back to the Gospel of John, we find a very similar structure to what we identified in the beginning of the first letter of John. We have a personal encounter between. Oh, this is not what I want to show. This is what I want to show you. We have a personal encounter between a disciple and Jesus that involves physical perception. He sees Jesus and he's even invited to touch Jesus, but then we don't even know if he actually touches Jesus, if Thomas actually touches Jesus. But what we end up is a confession, my Lord and my God. And this confession shows us that Jesus is identified. This is the typical believing in the Johannine sense, that Jesus is identified as the one who he is, but also this is a re-evaluation, of the own personal relationship to him, my Lord and my God. And then we encountered the sentence we already saw, blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. So from this experience, physical experience of a disciple, historical physical experience of a disciple, we are directed to the belief of those who did not see, and then we have to take into account to understand this verse correctly, the end of the following two verses, and especially this one. But these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. You see, life is again something that is also reused in the beginning of the first letter of John, and we see that the means that lead someone to believe in Jesus is in fact the written gospel of John that represents in his performation, not only as a written object, but also in his performation in the community of believers, the experiences that the eyewitnesses made, and that the readers of the gospel can connect to. And since the community is not only with a past Christ, but with the risen actual Christ, they can be, from these experiences, brought into the present community with the risen Christ. Thank you for your attention.